Hi everyone, Lisa here. And it is day 23 in my hashtag 78 days, and today is the world. So I'm filming in a very, very smoky world indeed. The wildfires and inverted temperatures or whatever. I don't really understand the meteorology of this, but it's kind of post-apocalyptic here as Hurricane Irma bearing down in the southeast. Again, I'm just struck by the ways in which our little journey through the 78 cards is corresponding to some wacky stuff with our world, and not to mention all the political and kind of other ways in which, as I study the Trumps, another Trump is making his presence known. Anyway, be that as it may, this is a digression. I want to talk about the world, and this is a card that is extremely near and dear to me because of the ways in which this card demonstrates a kind of completion of a journey that begins. This is the Solabusca Fool, the Fool of that weird tarot deck. The first tarot deck that has survived with all 78 cards intact. It comes from 1491. It was drawn and then engraved and colored in this beautiful detail, and it's the deck that has the first example of scenically illustrated pips that we can find. It's also the first deck that actually numbers the Fool with a 0, and that's really important to me in ways that I've tried to talk a little bit about before. I think the main thing I want to talk about is just the ways in which the journey of the small self as we enter into our world become identified with the things that we care about. We try to separate ourselves from the things that we don't like. We create this self-other divide. As we move into that process of individuation, it's also a process where the kind of blankness, the emptiness, the nothingness of our original being becomes everything, becomes an entire world. There's a famous discussion of the Buddha way, of the Buddha Dharma, of the path of being a follower of the Buddha, that says to study the Buddha way is to study the self. Okay, so all of our investigations into the meaning of reality begin with our mindful attention to this body, heart, and mind. So to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. So as we dive into this experience of our own bodies, hearts, and minds, one of the things that happens is that we start to realize that what we take to be Lisa, as opposed to not Lisa, that those distinctions are arbitrary. And we start to forget, we start to unbind this certitude of who and what we are. So to study the self is to forget the self. And then the next part of that saying, to forget the self, is to become verified and confirmed in the 10,000 things. So that as we let go of our narrow identification of self with a small s, what comes forward is the whole world, self with a big S, Atma, they might say in Hinduism, the large self, the large soul, the whole world. So in every way, the relationship between the Fool and her path of self-discovery is the relationship between the Fool as the first card, the 0 card, and the 21st trump, the world. Now, in the Solabusca Tarot, and what I'm using here is actually Lane Wilkinson's Solabusca Revisited, where she's kind of taken off the identifying names for these cards, which identify each of the trump cards, or many of them, with historical figures and mythological figures. She's taken those away so that we can kind of assimilate her deck to the major arcana as we know it from the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery. But this is the world in her deck, and in the Solabusca. And in the original, this card is identified with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is the example, or one of the prime examples in the Bible, of a king who rises into great power only to be completely humbled, lose himself. He literally goes crazy in his prideful attachment to his own accomplishments. God sort of strikes him with madness. He goes crazy for 7 years. It becomes like an insentient beast before his wits return to him, and he humbles himself before God. So in the example of Nebuchadnezzar, we have someone who rises to the height of sovereignty. Like if we think here of the Wheel of Fortune, he rises to the height of sovereignty only to lose it all and to completely forget himself. And at that moment, to be reunited with God and to find true fulfillment in that divine source, in that divine nature, that divine reality. The world, as we see it in the story of Nebuchadnezzar, is just another version of the world card as a figure of culmination as we see it in the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery. So this image of the dancer, right, who's got 2 batons, 2 wands, right, who is in the middle of this sort of Ouroboros-like wreath surrounded by the 4 figures that signify the truth of the gospel. She's at the center of it all. And so the 0 of the Solabusca, the 0 of the Fool, has become now the Ouroboros, or the world circle, or the cosmic egg, the womb from which everything emerges. This is a card that is about culmination. It's about losing the self in order to find the big self most completely. So, in my own life, as I deliver these words from my office, speaking somewhat quietly because of all the weirdness of filming at work, I'm really acutely aware of the ways in which my attachments to my identity as a self with a small s, to whoever Lisa is in terms of what she's accomplished and what she stands face to face against in the world, how all of that, my attachment to that, actually keeps me from the fullness of completion, from my ability to really hold the whole world, as opposed to being consumed by it in the way that Nebuchadnezzar in this image is being consumed by the dragon that is, I think, a symbol of God's wrath. So how do we open ourselves, let go of ourselves enough to open ourselves to the whole wide world? Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for joining me today, and as always, thank you for your practice.